The banquet hall was already decorated, 42 chairs empty on one side of the aisle. White orchids on every table nobody from my side would be smelling that afternoon. It was 4:07 p.m. on a Saturday in April, 72 degrees, string quartet already tuning, and I was standing in the bridal suite in my dress, looking at a text message from my father that had arrived exactly 11 days earlier, and that I'd read probably 40 times since. "We're not coming to watch you throw your life away on that boy. Don't expect us to pretend otherwise." Not one of them came. Not my mother. Not my sister Camille. Not a single aunt or cousin from either side of a family I'd spent 30 years believing I understood the shape of. Theo's family filled 2 rows. Mine filled none. I walked down that aisle anyway, on my own, because nobody had offered to walk me, and I smiled through the whole ceremony, in the specific, practiced way you smile when you've decided a wound isn't allowed to show on camera. But here's what none of them knew. Sitting at home that afternoon, congratulating themselves on their principles. In exactly 2 years, they'd be sitting across a conference table from me, needing my signature on a document, because the building their restaurant sat inside of already had my name on it. It had for 6 years. They just hadn't read the paperwork. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Joe, 30, a commercial real estate broker from Charlotte, North Carolina. This is the story of how my entire family skipped my wedding to punish me for who I married, and how the building housing their own restaurant turned out to already belong to me. If you've ever been abandoned for a decision that was actually the best one you ever made, stay with me. Drop a comment and subscribe, because the paperwork in this one is doing all the talking. I was 11 when my parents opened their first restaurant, a modest Caribbean fusion spot in a strip mall, and I remember spending most weekends there as a kid, folding napkins and rolling silverware, while my sister Camille, 7 at the time, got to sit in the office coloring because my mother thought Camille was too sensitive for the noise of the dining room. I was, apparently, not too sensitive for anything. I was useful. By 14, I was doing the restaurant's basic bookkeeping on weekends, unpaid, because my father said it would teach me responsibility. By 16, I understood their profit and loss statements better than either of my parents did, catching a vendor overcharge one summer that saved them roughly $4,200 over the following year, a fact I mentioned once at dinner, and that my father acknowledged with a single, "Good, that's what we're paying them for," as though the vendor, not me, had been the one to catch it. Camille, meanwhile, got a car for her 16th birthday, a full ride to a small private college my parents helped subsidize with $31,000 across 4 years, and a wedding, 3 years before mine, that my parents spent an estimated $58,000 on chateaux, the venue, the dress, a honeymoon to Belize, because Camille's now husband, Andre, came from what my mother called a good family, a phrase I heard so often growing up that I understood, well before I could articulate it, exactly what it meant and exactly who it excluded. I have a certificate from a statewide business plan competition I won in my senior year of high school, a modest $500 prize, and a plaque that said my name and the placement. It's in a drawer in my current house. It never made it onto a wall in my parents' house, not even the hallway wall, where Camille's dance recital photos and prom pictures were arranged in a kind of shrine that grew a new frame every couple of years. I met Theo the summer after I finished my MBA, at a barbecue thrown by a mutual friend. He was running his own small construction and renovation company, started with $8,000 in savings, and a truck he'd bought used, building it, over the following years, into a respected regional outfit with steady contracts. My parents met him exactly twice before the wedding, both times briefly, both times with a specific, chilly politeness that I recognized immediately, having watched them extend the same politeness to vendors they didn't respect. The restaurant nearly folded when I was 24. My parents' original investor, a family friend named Errol, pulled his capital out abruptly after a dispute over expansion plans, leaving them $95,000 short on a new commercial lease they'd already signed for a larger space. Plus build-out costs, neither of them had the liquidity to cover. My father called me, not Camille, and asked, with visible discomfort, if I knew anyone who might invest. I did know someone. Me. I'd been working in commercial real estate for 2 years by then, understood lease structures better than most people twice my age, and had saved aggressively since college, specifically because I distrusted on some instinctive level the idea that anyone in my family would ever hand me financial security freely. I offered to cover the shortfall myself, structured as an investment through a small LLC I formed for the purpose, with the informal understanding, stated verbally, more than once by my father, that I'd eventually be brought on as a silent partner in the business once things stabilized. Over the following 2 years, that initial $95,000 grew. I covered a further $34,000 in build-out costs when contractor estimates came in over budget, and $12,000 more when the health department required upgrades to the kitchen ventilation system that hadn't been in the original plan. Theo's company, which by then I was seeing seriously, ended up doing a significant portion of that build-out work directly. Cabinetry, electrical upgrades, flooring, at a steeply discounted rate, another $26,000 in value my parents never fully accounted for, because I never told them it was Theo's crew doing the work behind the general contractor's name on the invoices. I didn't hide it out of some grand strategy. I hid it because I already sensed, correctly, that knowing Theo's hands were in the walls of their restaurant would have complicated their willingness to accept the help at all. All told, by the time of my wedding 6 years later, my total contribution to that restaurant, capital, build-out, upgrades, and the discounted labor Theo's company provided, came to $167,000. And in 6 years, I was never once added as a partner. Every time I brought it up, gently, my father would say, "We'll get the paperwork sorted. Don't worry about it." And every time, the paperwork simply never materialized. At Camille's wedding, 3 years before mine, my mother introduced me to a table of relatives as our older one. She helped us out with the restaurant a little, a description so flattened it could have applied to someone who donated a folding table. At a family Easter dinner the year before my own wedding, my Aunt Denise asked how the restaurant had managed such a smooth expansion given the economy, and my father said, "We just made some smart calls, kept things lean," while I sat 4 seats away having wired $12,000 toward ventilation upgrades 8 months earlier. I didn't correct him. I'd stopped expecting the correction to matter by then, the wedding itself. I want to walk through carefully, because it's the center of this whole story, and it deserves to be told exactly as it happened. 11 days before the ceremony, my father called and, without much preamble, told me they weren't coming. Not him, not my mother, not Camille, who he said had agreed this was for the best. When I asked why, plainly, he said it was because of Theo, that boy, in his words, whose family, he said, isn't the kind of family we build alliances with. A sentence so nakedly transactional about my own marriage that I actually laughed, once, sharply, before he added the line that stayed with me longest. We're not coming to watch you throw your life away on that boy. Don't expect us to pretend otherwise. I asked if anyone, an aunt, a cousin, anyone, might still come. He said he'd made sure the family understood his position, and that he expected them to respect it. Nobody came. 42 empty chairs on one side of the aisle, orchids nobody from my side would smell. A string quartet playing to half a room. I walked down that aisle alone, because there was no one left in the family to offer, and Theo's parents, sitting in the front row on their side, both stood up as I passed, which is a small kindness I've never forgotten and never will. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't call my father from the bridal suite to beg or argue. I smiled through the ceremony, danced at the reception, and let myself cry exactly once, alone, in a bathroom stall for 4 minutes during the cocktail hour, before fixing my makeup and walking back out. Nobody at that wedding, not one of the 80 or so guests who did show up, all from Theo's side or our shared friends, asked where my family was. I think they already knew better than to ask. I want to be precise about what I did in the weeks after the wedding, because it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't really even about the restaurant yet. It was about my own boundaries first. I stopped taking my parents' calls for close to 2 months, not out of a grand strategy, just because I genuinely needed the space. When I did eventually speak to them again, I kept the conversations short, factual, and free of any reference to the wedding at all, because I'd decided, somewhere in that bathroom stall, that I wasn't going to spend any more of my energy trying to make them understand a decision they'd already refused to witness. I didn't touch the restaurant investment during this period. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I orchestrated some calculated financial reckoning in the immediate aftermath, and that isn't what happened. The LLC continued holding its interest in the lease exactly as it had for years. I simply stopped thinking about the restaurant as something I was owed acknowledgement for, and started thinking about it, when I thought about it at all, as a piece of paperwork sitting quietly in a folder, doing what paperwork does. The story that circulated after the wedding, relayed to me eventually through my Aunt Denise, who'd stayed in touch despite my father's instructions, was that I'd rushed into the marriage. That Theo was not who he presented himself as. Vague insinuations with no substance behind them. The kind of narrative families construct when the truth, that they simply thought his background wasn't good enough, is too plainly unflattering to say out loud. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't post anything. Didn't call relatives to set the record straight. Didn't even correct Denise directly beyond saying once, "Theo's wonderful, and I'm happy, and that's really all there is to it." What I did instead, the same procedural instinct that governs every part of my professional life, was keep my own quiet file, not of the gossip, but of the restaurant's paperwork, updated methodically over those 2 years, the way I'd update it for any client's commercial property. because letting documentation lapse is simply not something I know how to do, personally or professionally. Marguerite, my business partner and mentor at the brokerage, noticed I'd become quieter about family topics after the wedding, and one day, over coffee, asked directly whether I still held any interest in my parents' restaurant space. I told her about the LLC, the lease-to-own structure, the $167,000. She sat back and said, "Joe, does anyone in your family actually know what that paperwork says?" I honestly didn't know. I'd drafted the lease structure myself, 6 years earlier, exhausted and overworked and 24 years old, using a lease-to-own framework I'd learned from a mentor early in my career, the kind where an investor's capital contribution converts into a title interest once specific lease term conditions are met. I remembered structuring it that way. I didn't remember whether my parents had ever actually read past the signature page. 2 years after the wedding, the answer to Marguerite's question arrived on its own, through a piece of unrelated work. I was reviewing county title records for a completely separate commercial deal, a routine part of my job, cross-referencing property records in the same district where my parents' restaurant operated. Out of habit more than anything, I pulled up the restaurant building's title history. My LLC's name was already on it, not as a lien holder, not as a lease guarantor, as a title interest holder, with a maturing ownership clause that had, per the original agreement I'd drafted 6 years earlier, and my parents had signed without, apparently, having a lawyer review the fine print, fully vested the month before I happened to be looking at the record. The lease-to-own structure had run its full term. My $167,000 in capital and build-out costs had converted, exactly as designed, into outright ownership of the underlying property, subject only to the existing ground lease with the building's original landlord, Size, who, as it happened, had just listed the building for sale. I called Marguerite before I called anyone else, because I needed someone with no emotional stake in this to confirm I was reading the document correctly. She reviewed it with me for an hour and said plainly, "This isn't a gray area, Joe. You own the building your parents' restaurant sits inside of. They've been paying rent for 2 years on a lease-to-own agreement that already matured in your favor." I sat with that for a long time. This wasn't a story about being owed acknowledgement anymore. It was, in the most literal legal sense possible, a story about who actually held the deed to the ground under my family's feet, and they had no idea what happened next, unfolded almost entirely on the landlord's timeline, not mine, which is part of what made it feel less like an act of revenge and more like a fact, simply arriving on schedule. The original building owner, looking to divest, put the property up for sale, which triggered a formal notice to all parties with a recorded interest, including my LLC, and including my parents' business, as the operating tenant. My parents, per Marguerite's later account of the paperwork trail, assumed this meant they'd simply need to negotiate a new lease with whoever the eventual buyer turned out to be. I retained my own real estate attorney, a colleague named Reg Faulkner, to confirm every detail of the maturing title clause before I said a single word to my family. Reggie's read was unambiguous. My LLC held full title interest, subject only to finalizing the transfer paperwork with the county and settling the outgoing landlord's remaining ground lease terms, a closing cost of roughly $9,000 in fees and back adjustments, which I paid without hesitation, because by then the math had long since stopped being the hard part. My father called when the notice reached him, agitated, asking why some LLC had a claim on the building. I told him, plainly, that the LLC was mine, that it had held that interest since the build-out 6 years ago, and that the lease-to-own clause had simply matured. There was a long silence, and then he said, "You should have told us," which struck me, even then, as a strange thing to say about a document he and my mother had personally signed. Camille called 2 days later, not agitated, just quiet, asking if this meant they'd lose the restaurant. I told her, honestly, that it didn't have to, that as the new title holder, I fully intended to offer them a fair, formal lease, the kind we should have had in writing from the beginning, if they were willing to finally sit down and do the paperwork properly this time. The closing meeting took place at a title company conference room, the same kind of room I've sat in professionally more times than I could count, except this time I was on the other side of the table, the seller, or rather, the title holder, meeting with my parents and Camille, who'd come along for support, all three expecting, per what their own outgoing landlord's broker had apparently told them, a routine transition to a new building owner they didn't yet know was me. Reg opened the meeting by confirming, on the record, the chain of title sign, the original 2020 LLC investment agreement, the lease-to-own conversion clause, and its maturity 2 years prior, now finalized through the sale. My father asked, again, why none of this had been explained properly at the time. "It was in the agreement you signed," I said, calm, not raising my voice. "Page 4, Section 3. I didn't hide it. I drafted it exactly the way any lease-to-own investment is supposed to be drafted. I just don't think either of you read it, because at the time, you needed the $95,000 more than you needed to ask questions about the structure." My mother, quiet until then, said, "We trusted you to look out for us." "I did look out for you," I said, "for 6 years. I covered $167,000 in capital and build-out, so the restaurant wouldn't close. I never once asked for public credit for it. The only thing I ever asked for was to be made a partner, and that paperwork never happened. This did, instead, because I built it that way from the start, back when I was 24, and starting to understand that verbal promises in this family don't hold up the way documents do." I paused, then added the line I'd been holding for 2 years, without fully realizing it. "You didn't come to my wedding because you didn't approve of who I married. You're sitting in this room today because of what I built with him." Camille looked at our parents for a long moment. "Theo's crew did the build-out," she said slowly, putting something together in real time. "Didn't they? The cabinetry, the floors, discounted at cost," I said. $26,000 in value neither of you ever paid for." My father didn't have a response to that. He sat with the closing documents in front of him, the same posture, I imagine, he'd have if a vendor had finally, after years, sent him an invoice he couldn't argue his way out of. The restaurant didn't close. I drew up a formal 10-year commercial lease with my parents as tenants, market rate but structured with reasonable terms, reviewed this time by an attorney of their own choosing, with every clause explained in plain language before anyone signed anything. My father's leverage over the business he'd built his identity around shifted permanently. For the first time in 30 years, he answers to a landlord for that space, and the landlord is his daughter. My parents, standing among certain relatives, took a quiet hit once the story circulated, not through any effort of mine, but simply because Denise, and eventually Camille, told the truth of it plainly when asked. And the truth, this time, didn't need any embellishment to sound damning. Errol, the original investor who'd pulled out years earlier, apparently heard the story secondhand and sent me a brief, almost apologetic note. Glad, he said, that the restaurant had landed somewhere solid after all. As for me, Marguerite and I closed our best year yet at the brokerage, my name now attached, professionally, to a maturing interest deal case study she occasionally references with new associates, without naming names. Theo's construction company got 2 new referrals directly out of the restaurant's post-closing renovation, paid in full this time, no discount required. I finally hung that business plan certificate from high school on my office wall, the plaque and the ribbon both, 17 years after nobody in my parents' house made room for it on a shelf. It's been 8 months since that closing. My parents and I speak now, carefully, mostly about the restaurant, occasionally about smaller things. Camille and I are closer than we've ever been, something neither of us expected to come out of a title dispute. My mother has never fully addressed the wedding directly, though she did, unprompted, ask to see photos from it a few months ago, which I understood, in its quiet way, as close to an apology as I was likely to get. Theo and I hung our own wedding photo in our living room last spring, just the 2 of us, and his parents standing behind us in the front row, the only family who showed up that day. I look at it more than I look at almost anything else in that house. Family isn't the people who approve of your choices. It's the people who show up anyway, and sometimes the people who build the thing you're standing on without ever needing to be thanked for it out loud. If you've ever built something quietly, for people who wouldn't even show up to watch you build a life of your own, you already know that the truth of what you're owed doesn't disappear just because nobody wanted to read the paperwork. It's still there. It just waits for the right closing date. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who's ever been left standing alone at the front of a room that should have been full. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have said at that title company. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more where this came from.